Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the newest episode of Inflection Point Podcast. This is our first episode in the new year, and I hope everyone out there in our listening audience had a really great holiday season. Whatever it is you celebrate, that it was blessed, it was peaceful, and it was joyful. So we're really excited to kind of get our year started. We have some new topics that we're going to be talking about. For this particular episode, we're going to talk about, we're going to continue a conversation that we had started back in December. But before we jump into that, I want to have Gail and Mavis say their hellos to everyone.
Well, hello and welcome. And I wish you all a very happy, joyful New Year.
Hi, it's Mavis. Happy New Year. I'll probably say that through January. Great to have you with us.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you've seen us before, you know how this goes. We are the Anti-Racism Mastermind Group, and we are your guides on a journey towards anti-racism. The last session we had, we opened up this conversation about identity, and we talked about the role that identity plays in the history of enslavement through Reconstruction, various movements and all that sort of thing. So we had a lot that we wanted to cover. We didn't get a chance to cover everything. So we're going to kind of continue that conversation now around this issue of identity. And what we are going to do over the course of maybe the next 2 to 3 sessions is we're going to develop this conversation, but just stay with us because the conversation gets further and further along, and it kind of mixes historical, it mixes things that we would like to see in the future and all that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about identity across 6 movements. And when I talk about movements, I'm talking about social movements, I'm talking about political movements and things of that nature. And so looking at how identity, particularly for us in the African American community, how did our identity morph and change over the course of these different movements and things like that? So not just our identity in terms of how we see ourselves, but also the identity in terms of how other people see us. Because to a great extent, our identity we have been misidentified, I'll put it like that, in terms of this very broad, monolithic way of looking at who we are and all of that. And so we're going to dive into some of those conversations. So we're going to talk about 6 movements, starting with the Great Migration. We're going to talk about Harlem Renaissance, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Nationalist Movement. We'll talk about the Black Panther Party, and we will talk about the global Black Lives Matter of movements. So you can see how that history is flowing from one movement into another, and how the way we see ourselves as Black folks living in the United States kind of changes with the course of time as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, how other people look at us and define us sometimes monolithically and that sort of thing. So we're going to just open up the conversation, and this is intended to just be a very sort of an ad hoc conversation, so Mavis and Gail can jump in at any time. We're going to talk about the Great Migration. And you think about the Great Migration was that period of time between roughly the early to mid 1900s, 1917 through 1970. And so there was a lot of stuff that was going on. So when you think about the word migration, you think about movement, you think about people generally going from one sort of locale and sort of beginning to spread out and all of that. So from the African American perspective, coming out of enslavement, going through the Civil War, going through Reconstruction, going through Jim Crow and all of these things. But I think one thing that I really want to drive home is that these things aren't necessarily working in parallel, that they're all kind of flowing together in these different time periods that are overlapping and things like that. And so there's this time period where we're starting to grow. For example, during Reconstruction and emancipation and all of that, we have the opportunity to kind of start to grow for a little bit. Then things started to change. Now people are using the laws to encode our movement, to encode what it is we're allowed to do, codifying our behaviors and codifying how we're identified and things like that. And so all of this has been happening over a period of time. When you think about the Great Migration, that was that period of real movement. And it was movement from the South, coming up through the North, going out towards the Midwest area. So we're talking areas like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, as far as Los Angeles and all of that. So if you can just imagine these people looking for opportunity to exercise their freedom, because that's really what it boiled down to, right? So Gail, Mavis, any comments from that Great Migration perspective?
Trying to exercise their freedom, but they're also trying to develop their identity, right? Who am I and who am I free to be now? And unfortunately, they kept being met with many different codes, as you said, and laws that were never changed completely, and new ones that were put in place that really restricted their ability to develop that total identification. Yeah, sorry, Mavis.
Yeah. Oh, it's okay. If I'm not mistaken, I remember reading in it's Isabel Wilkerson, right, in the book The Great Migration, that very often men left their families to go and find work, and then to bring their families up north. And you think a little bit about, I guess I did, I thought about the separation and the hope when the receptivity in the north was not that great, and these families were already separated, probably with no resources or very little to get back together. So I just thought it was interesting that they had to separate that way, which was the nightmare of anybody coming out of the slavery period.
Mm-hmm. Because you also have to remember that that whole concept of separation was a part of the enslavement. I mean, being separated from your native land, going all the way back to different countries in Western Africa, the Atlantic slave trade and all of that was all about separation. And so physically separated, emotionally separated, psychologically, mentally, spiritually, everything, this separation of being ripped from everything that you're familiar with.
Your identity again.
Your identity, yeah. Exactly. Your very identity being ripped away from you. And so that idea of separation is definitely a prevailing thought, if you will, that occurs throughout all of these experiences and that sort of thing. So so when you picture the Great Migration, tell me, like, what are some of the things that you see in your mind when you think about that whole entire thing?
And I think about they must have been really having a lot of hope and possibilities. And, because they've been so enslaved and restricted for all those decades and decades and decades that all of a sudden they're free to travel without being, killed or because they left the plantation. And so they had to feel a lot of hope, but then the disappointment, the disillusionment that probably they kept meeting along that path, right, as they started migrating.
Still,
Because I mean, you hit the nail right on the head in what you said. It was the hope of freedom.
Right.
It's the hope of opportunity.
Right.
It's the hope of a better life. But when you have multiple turns, you're going in this direction, you're hit with Jim Crow. You go in this direction, you're hit with something else. And the lynchings and all of that stuff was still going on during the Great Migration period. But the thing that drove people, at least from my understanding and my reading, is just this desire to be free and to really, really experience that liberty that is talked about in this country. Some of the things that we've talked about, liberty and justice for all, but clearly it was not meant for all. And so when you're
economic liberty,
exactly,
no economic independence,
exactly, and just trying to figure it all out, right? So if you think about leaving the South, and the South is all you've ever known, and you're moving, taking a chance on moving to a place that you've never experienced before. It's almost like what they experience in being taken from Africa and brought to the United States. It's all over. It's all that kind of thing all over again, except it's now within this country.
Another traumatization, right, Gail? Another full-on set of traumas.
Meeting one trauma after another.
Yeah. You know what I think of, Anita, is I've read and watched a lot about the dirty 30s and the migration of people towards, the gold rush days, and how, the grapes of wrath and so many people on a wagon trying to move their families to different places with hope of work and so on. And I think I saw a picture in the last couple of days in one of the films we're watching where there was a Black family looking just like that, trying to do the same thing in their migration north with nothing. And you have to wonder about the losses they incurred on the way. And I just can't imagine that many people welcomed them with open arms.
Yeah, of course. I mean, because racism, discrimination, prejudice, bias, all of that existed in the North as well. It just was seen it was a little bit more covert, I would say, in the North than in the South. It was just kind of directly in your face, but it was still here. And so being able to overcome that and to have that resilience, to just keep moving forward, no matter what, just keep on moving forward. And I think another aspect of that is just this idea of the next generation, things will be better. If we do what we're doing in this generation, it's not just for me, it's also for my future. It's for those future generations. It's for those little Kairos that are going to be growing up and hopefully being able to participate in this country as a citizen, ought to be able to participate in this country. That was the hope. So when I think about, if I was one of those individuals, I would think that there's just such a mixture of emotions, because there's fear, but there's excitement. There's excitement. And the bottom line is, I would imagine just kind of thinking, well, things can't be worse than what we just came through. So it's just this hope for the better. And as we go through these different movements, I think we'll see that that hope is always there, right? That hope is
Right.
always there, because this is what the Constitution says. This
Right.
whole thing, liberty and justice for all. I think of all the people that live in the United States. I would say that Black people are the ones that really, really understand what that actually means
Mhm.
to have full liberty.
Yeah.
Not what does it mean from the standpoint of necessarily experiencing it,
Right.
but just from the standpoint of that is the goal,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they
That's
know,
cool.
it's like people say that to know up, you must know down. Well, they know the absence of that freedom of liberty. And so they also would then know the experience of that liberty, each step that they took, that they reclaimed it.
Anita and Gail, I'm about to say something not very smart, so I'm giving you heads up. Growing up in a white environment and knowing about Black people, I just thought Black people just were. I had no idea that there was this full-on connection to slavery. I had never heard of the Great Migration until just a few years ago. So I was not aware that there was this history of trauma and the close connection that we have with those eras of slavery, of the Great Migration. I mean, the Great Migration went until I was in high school. That's just not that long ago. So was that bad, Anita? Was that really horrible? I just didn't know. I thought that just like somebody has blue eyes, somebody has brown, there's Black people and there's white people and there's everything in between.
Right. But I don't think you're alone in that.
I don't think so. That's why I said it.
I would probably venture to say that the majority of white people in America don't really understand and know.
Don't connect it.
Right. And so it's almost like we've just been, like we talk about identification, we've been very superficially, I know I use the word monolithically, but it's also very superficially that we've been defined. We've made no contribution. We're just kind of here. We were enslaved. We complain about racism. We complain about discrimination. Like, why don't you just get over it?
Yeah.
But I think we're in a different time now. When you look at things that led up to where we are right now, when you think about, the work that's happening around this country in the areas of anti-racism, in the areas of eradicating racism and all of that, that's a really bold thing to say and to strive towards, is this idea of eradicating racism, because it really boils down to people being educated as to what it actually is. How did it impact me? How does it impact me in 1971 when I stood outside of my school under these new rules of forced integration? 1971.
Right.
We're not talking 71. We're talking 1971. Right. That's a very vivid memory for me.
Yeah.
And that doesn't even scratch the surface of people experiencing being in the South and being enslaved and going through the Great Migration and all of that.
Right. And the change in communication, the ease of it now. I think this really is a different time with the same problems, but it's a different time and we can do something about this long existing racism.
Exactly. So I wanted to mention a woman that I met. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Body, and she's with, let me make sure I got it right. She's with Baylor University. She's the assistant professor of the Diane R. Garland School of Social Work. And she's also a part of the George W. Truett Theological Seminary School of Education. That's a mouthful, right? So as you all know, I'm a member of ASALH, which is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, right? And we, at the local level, we do at the national and the local level, but my involvement is mostly at the local level. And we do a lot of programs. And Dr. Body came and did a program for us, and she focused on the Great Migration. She calls it, her project is Unfinished Business from the Great Migration to the Black Lives Matter. So I wanted to read something to you that I thought was really, really interesting. It's just a general description of her work. It's kind of this ethnography research and all of that. So it's really looking at the culture and the stories and what is happening to the people at that level. And so what she says is Unfinished Business connects themes of relocation, resistance, remembering, resilience, resplendence that have passed from the silent revolution of the Great Migration to the louder contemporary movements of Black lives. And so I like the way it's connected, because that statement right there feels very fluid to me. And that's kind of how I see all of this, as being very fluid, that it's not these discrete blocks, that this stuff is just happening all at once and, across this spectrum of a time. And it just goes on to say, Unfinished Business is an ethnographic research project that uses a multimodal approach. And what that means is really just understanding who we are, understanding our stories, understanding our experiences, not from a factual perspective, from facts and, all of that, but from the human perspective. Like, who are we? What are the things that we've done? What was it like being, like, what is it like being Black in America? We've talked about all different subjects and everything around that, but I just wanted to kind of bring up Dr. Body's work, because the work that she did is pretty incredible. Okay. Mm-hmm. So at this point, we're going to start our conversation a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to start with that time period. So most people think of the Harlem Renaissance, and because it's called the Harlem Renaissance, most people associate it with New York. But it's also referred to as the New Negro Movement. So if you tie that in with the Great Migration, it's all about movement. It's all about movement, and what does it feel like to experience the freedom? I'll put that in quotes a little bit, to be able to pack your bags and just go to New York or go to Chicago and all of that. Yeah, when I think about it, it just, I get kind of goosebumps sometimes when I think about all of this. But what do you think of that name when you hear Harlem Renaissance versus the New Negro Movement? So have you ever heard those two phrases connected together, or was it always just kind of the Harlem Renaissance?
I never understood the Harlem Renaissance, not the two connected. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I did think it had to do with New York, because of all the elegance and everything that is in the Harlem area. The buildings, and those reflected it. Am I right on that? That might be my perception, but like the Apollo Theater, and just and if you don't mind, I'm going to toss back to Dr. Body, that she was focused on the cultural aspects of what Blacks brought throughout this. And that's something else I haven't considered kind of separately. How, jazz has changed music, how their art, how everything, the human beings just express themselves in art in all forms. And Black people have done it since the very beginning as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's somehow we've kind of, white people, it seems, have, kind of subsumed most of it, like, oh, this is American. But this is a huge gift that needs to be acknowledged for its roots.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's about our culture. Our culture is part of our identity and all of that. And when you really look at one of the results of the Great Migration, besides, some of the things that you just talked about with the music and the dance and all of that, was also that America was beginning to be influenced by our culture, even though to a great extent, there's lots of misappropriation. There's, all of these different types of factors that are going on. You've had musicians that produce their music, but the production companies got all the money, just different things like that. But I always look at when I think about the Harlem Renaissance and this whole new Negro movement. So that's like another identity shift, right? When you think about it, this identity shift to this new Negro movement and everything, I think about, I just really, really get a sense of freedom of expression and freedom of all of that stuff that may have been pent up for so long, now being able to be freely expressed, even if it's just within our community. It's still being able to be freely expressive of who you are. And then I think about the Great Migration, Harlem Renaissance and all of that. But then when I connect it back to the slave trade, all of those gifts and talents and stuff that were contained within those individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's no surprise to me that generationally, all of that culture is still maintained. It's still maintained. Until finally we get to that place where we're able to move beyond the boundaries of the South and move beyond those intellectual boundaries, move beyond those cultural boundaries, and get to a very different place. Right?
It's like coming back to self. It's like coming back to the core, to where you can, right? The origins, and looking at identity and where Black people really came from, and that was all part of their culture, right? With music and arts and so forth.
Yeah,
and
music, art, gospel.
Right, as much as horrible things were happening, somehow that wasn't destroyed.
Revived.
Right. Exactly. Which I think
I'm so grateful for that. There's just so much about the Black culture, Black everything that I appreciate, and I'm grateful that Black people are as generous as they are to us.
So it's almost time for us to take a break. And as usual, we always get caught up in the conversation in all of that. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about some specific individuals that we decided to call out. I mean, there are hundreds of them that, during this time period that I'm kind of looking at within the context of the Harlem Renaissance and the music and the literature and all of that. So when we come back, we're going to talk about 3 specific individuals that each one of us have decided that there was something about that person that we could really, really relate to. So we'll take a break and we'll come back and continue. Okay, so welcome back to the second half of our session, where we're going to continue our conversation about the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro movement. And just for a reference of a time, this was kind of like in the 1920s through the 1930s kind of a time frame. And so the person that I chose to talk about is Zora Neale Hurston. So for those of you who don't know much about Zora Neale Hurston, she's an author. And the thing that's really cool about her is that she wrote a lot from the standpoint of of folklore, of African folklore, and the folklore of the South, and just different things along those lines. And so one of her books is a book called Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo.
Mm-hmm.
And this gentleman that is it's him telling her story. So she's going down to, I believe it's in Alabama, and she is interviewing this individual who at the age of 19 was still living in Africa and found himself caught up in the slave trade, right? So what's interesting about his story, his name is Kudjo Lewis. That's his American name. His actual African name was Oluwele Kosula. Oh, it might be Oluwela Kosula. But he is an individual who was just born in the right time period, so to speak, that he experienced the Middle Passage, he experienced the Civil War, he experienced Reconstruction. So if you can kind of hold that in your mind. So in 1927, he was the last living survivor of the Atlantic slave trade between Africa and the United States. 1927. Just let that sink in for a moment. This is a man who at the age of 19, I think when he passed away, he was like in his 90s or so. At the age of 19, was getting ready to get married and was kidnapped. However, the way he was taken, it was because of it was like a neighboring community, or a neighboring kingdom, I should say, who was in, and this is in Africa, so this is a neighboring kingdom that was involved in the slave trade. So everybody knows that there were, to a certain extent, that there were Africans that were also involved in the slave trade. And this particular king came to Mr. Lewis's community and literally raided the community, killing most of the people in his community and taking him as well as some other people and putting them on a ship. And there's a part in the story in one of the interviews when he's describing, let me see if I can find it. So members of the nearby kingdom invaded his camp and slaughtered his family. And after being held prisoner by the invaders, he was brought to the coast where he was sold to a slave ship and brought to Alabama along with other slaves, even though the importation of slaves from Africa had been prohibited in 1808. So if you know how the slavery progressed, it started off with the Atlantic slave trade, but then the Atlantic slave trade was abolished. And in the United States, it was also abolished. But for about 50 years, it continued. So people were just kind of doing it undercover, you know, that sort of thing, but still going into the interior of Africa or the coastal countries along Africa and kidnapping people, taking people, or, you know, in his case, his village was, people were slaughtered, right, by other Africans and that sort of thing. So he finds himself, there's a part in there, I can't find it exactly right now, where it's describing what he what he was experiencing when he first saw the ocean, because he had never seen the ocean before. So now it's like one of the earlier conversations that we were having when we were talking about, can you imagine? When we did that visualization, can you imagine? Right? And so Zora Neale Hurston meets this guy and starts talking with him over the course of several years to kind of get the book. The book was completed but not published in 2018. So she got a lot of resistance because when she wrote the story, she did not interject herself into the story. So it was 100% his storyline, his dialect. And so in that time period, this sort of African mixture of African English dialect was just not something that was very well received. And so she got turned down by several publishers, and the book wasn't published until 2018. Did you hear me? 2018. That's what is that? 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Literally 4 years ago,
Wow.
that his story was finally told. And it's a powerful, incredible story.
I have to read that.
Yeah. And so the book ends up getting published 60, I believe it's 60 years after Zora Neale Hurston passed away. So the point I'm making also with all of this and all of these discussions is that this stuff is timeless.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at the severity of the period of enslavement, but the remnants of that are still very much in play here. Mm-hmm. So I want to shift it over to Gail, because I want to make sure that we get all three of our people covered. So I'm going to shift it over to Gail, and she's going to share a little bit about a gentleman by the name of Carl Hansberry.
So Carl Hansberry, in the 1930s, he and his wife, Nanny, they decided to leave. He came from Mississippi, I believe, and she came from Tennessee. And he was a real estate broker, and she was a school teacher. And they managed to save, and they went to Chicago, and they managed to save up enough money to buy a home. Now, when African Americans sought to move their families to more favorable conditions, they faced a really difficult structure of policies and customs designed to maintain racial exclusion. Restrictive covenants introduced as a response to the influx of Black people during the Great Migration were clauses written into deeds that outlawed African Americans from buying, leasing, or living in properties in white neighborhoods, with the exception of servants. But by the 1920s, the widespread use of these restrictive covenants kept as much as about 85% of Chicago off limits to African Americans. And so he decided that he was going to change that. And he was, as I said, he was a real estate broker. He also started the first Black bank in Chicago.
Wow.
Right. And this is a very bright guy. So he decided he knew somebody that was white and that was a white realtor and who was very progressive at that time. And he was able to get this house bought in an area that was all white, right? But it was also in an area where the restricted covenants were clearly instated. So what began to happen, obviously, was that the people in the neighborhood began to protest them and became very hostile. And they threw bricks at their windows. They were always being harassed. The kids, there were 4 kids in the family. The youngest was 7, I think, when they moved there. And her name is Lorraine, and I'm gonna tag her onto Dad. And it was really terrifying. And the neighborhood, there was a woman that pressed charges and did a case against him, and he was forced out of the house, and she won, or the neighborhood won. But he decided he was going to take it further, and so he went to the Supreme Court. He he was determined to make sure that these laws were going to change for him and for everybody. He eventually was able to win in the Supreme Court, and they did reverse some of these laws. It took many, many other people a decade or so after that before the actual full law was changed. I think it was in 1968 that was completely changed. And so he never lived to see that. He was so frustrated with the process and the length of time it was taking in the Supreme Court. I think he was moving his family to Mexico because he no longer wanted to live in a country that was treating him and others so unfairly. But there was a court decision in 1940 that he did hear, but the Fair Housing Act didn't occur until 1968, right? But there's another piece to this, and that's his youngest daughter. Lorraine Hansberry, when she was older, and her father knew many people, and many people that were very well established figures in theater and culture would come to their house. And so she grew up knowing a lot of people. And so she decided she was going to move to New York. And she originally wrote for Freedom, which is a progressive publication founded by the celebrated singer and activist Paul Robeson. During this time, she also wrote a play called Raisin in the Sun. I believe was the first play on Broadway, written by a Black author, by a Black playwright. And as much as they all thought that it was going to fail miserably, it actually succeeded and ran for about 19 months. And after that was then made into a movie where Sidney Poitier, I believe, was the primary actor in the film. And so but the other thing that she got involved with was something called the Forum. And the Forum, which makes me think about what we're trying to do here and trying to create conversations, right? And the Forum that she participated in was made up of people that were in the cultural neighborhoods and the cultural arts during that time in New York, but they were a mixture of white and Black people, both. One of the things that she really was really upset about was very similar issues to what's going on now. They called the Town Hall Forum. It was designed for white liberals and Black activists to have this open conversations about the tensions that were mounting because of the civil rights movement. And again, this is all still in that whole process of migration, right? So what they were talking about doing was possibly looking at other forms of protest, because being quiet and passive and trying to go through the judicial system, which took forever, was not exactly working and being very effective, right? So they believed they had to find some way with the dialogue that they were experiencing to show and encourage the white liberals to stop being so liberal and become more of an American radical. And that's a quote from her. Writing in her journal 2 days later, after she made this quote in late 1950s, early 60s, she described the event as being explosive, that she said, Black people are so angry and white people are so confused and sensitive to criticism. The Black panelists included writers like Paul Marshall, John O'Killens, and Leroy Joines, along with actors like Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, James Weschler, and a columnist for the New York Post was another of the white panelists. He wrote that the Association of Artists for Freedom was ambushing captive white liberals. Meanwhile, somebody else argued that the Village Voice, actually, the white panel members, were estranged from the Negro reality. He said Weschler simply did not have the capacity to really listen to what was being said. And during the town hall forum, Lorraine Hansberry was battling much more than that. She's also battling cancer. I believe she was young when she died, in her 30s. But she was really part of a movement at that point in time, not that dissimilar to what we're trying to do, right? And trying to have conversation, trying to learn what's really going on, to have people have a voice and express what they believe. And that search for identity and for how we all fit together here. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. That was really good. That
stuff.
that
Yeah.
play, I've never actually seen the play. I've seen the movie multiple times of Raisin in the Sun. It's definitely one of my favorites. So at this point, we're going to switch it over to Mavis, and Mavis is going to share her thoughts on Ida B. Wells.
I'll start though by saying that everyone should see A Raisin in the Sun. I just watched it today, knowing that Gail was researching this family, and Lorraine actually wrote the screenplay as well. Sometimes authors are pushed aside for that. Screenwriters want to do their own thing. So I was really impressed that the film is so completely moving. So yes, I've been really interested in Ida B. Wells. I've been seeing a lot about her in the news, even on Twitter, and with respect to the 1619 project that I've been following. Hannah Nicole Jones, I just learned this yesterday, that Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist herself, received the Pulitzer Prize posthumously on the same day that Hannah Nicole Jones did, which must have felt so awesome for Hannah. Anyway, so I feel like in ways I'm channeling Ida B. Wells. If you know me, you might hear some things, not to sound too pompous, but I'm just so inspired by her life. She was born into slavery, and then she became a teacher. Her mom was a teacher. She actually went to school with her own children. This is post-slavery. And then in that process, Ida learned how to teach. And as she went through life, she started wanting to express her opinion about things, specifically lynchings. And she had even accepted it, if this source is correct, as just kind of the way it was in the South, that hanging men mostly for no crime at all, no charges, just they can say, the crowd could say anything the Black person had done, and there would be a lynching. And she chronicled, I think 720 lynchings over the years in the South, and found that only 1/3 of those lynched had actually committed some sort of crime. The most common accusation is, this person raped a white woman. And I think it was Hannah Nicole Jones who said that is a threadbare lie, and they used it constantly. So anyway, she, uses her pen to get her stories out. And when I first heard about Ida B. Wells, I thought, how did she survive the backlash? Well, she was clever. She moved, she would see an uprising in a certain area, or people, I think in one case, burned down the newspaper house that she was working for. And so she just slipped out and came back down to Memphis, I think. Anyway, most of her work was done in Chicago. So she would be technically part of the migration. And she dressed better than I do. She liked to dress up. She wanted to be a proper lady and just to fit into society. And she boarded a train once, the ladies' car, and she was manhandled and taken out of that car into the smoking car because she was Black. And she actually sued the railroad and won $500. I just love her determination. She was not going to give up ever. And another thing I liked about her, and I think about this when I'm writing, is that she wrote in a common sense way. She wanted all Blacks from wherever they were to be able to read her newspapers, her articles, and to reach as many people as she could. She documented things about the inequality in education. She, let me see here. So yeah, I think I sort of jumped ahead of myself in terms of everything that she did throughout her life. But she finally married at 31. Go girl, she waited and married a lovely man who was apparently going to represent her as her attorney. She had 4 children. And she went on speaking tours about how the US was treating its Black citizens while she was nursing her children. And I just, I think any of us women today could identify with a woman like that, who's doing everything in her physical power to get her opinion out and to help people. I think we're running close to being out of time, but she was instrumental in dealing with poverty. And anyway, if I didn't read the quote up top, I'm going to read it again. But she said, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." And I'm going to read as much as I can about her. And I hope I get to channel more of her. She's just amazing, amazing woman.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So these three individuals were just three examples of the people, the caliber of people, that determination and all of that were part of the Great Migration and a part of the Harlem Renaissance and all of that. So when I go back and think a little bit more about Zora Neale Hurston, it was her interest in African American and Caribbean folklore, but she really focused on how these elements come together in the community's identity. So we're talking a lot of this stuff about identity. And so you're thinking about you think about the Harlem community, that you sort of have like a certain perception of what that community identity was like and all of that. And when I think about myself just kind of growing up and like the Black Arts Festivals, just about every major city that I'm aware of had a Black Arts Festival. And so these are the types of things that grew out of the Harlem Renaissance, which grew out of the Great Migration. Okay, so our time is just about over. So of course we want to be able to kind of throw out some information about who we are, how you can kind of connect with us. So I'm going to let Gail go, but do it quick.
All right. Well, I'm a therapist, but I do run this nonprofit called OMA, Center for Mind, Body, and Spirit, but it's at www.omapittsburgh.org. And if you're interested in some of the programs that we offer, a lot of them are online right now. So please check it out. Thank you.
And I work with an organization called seedabetterlife.org. We work with orphans and vulnerable children in Rwanda, and we are very focused on education and peaceful coexistence. So check it out. Yes, and donate if you can.
And of course, I'm Anita Russell, and I am the founder of The Place to Soar, which the SOAR is an acronym for Step Out. Oh my God. An acronym for Step Out and Redesign. And it's all about personal transformation. I created this activism through coaching model, and out of that model emerged this podcast. And so all of this, all of the things that we do, we talked last time about our paths converging. Actually, when we were on the Dr. Pat show, we talked about how our paths, these three wise women's paths coming together and converging to do this type of work here. So we're just really, really excited about what it is we're doing. We're very excited about how we're going to be rolling some things out for the new year. And one of the things that we're going to be doing starting in February is that we're going to have a guest come on our show. And the first gentleman that we will have is an expert at genealogy. And so we're going to continue that conversation about identity from the standpoint of genealogy. So make sure you catch us on the third Wednesday of this month, and we'll introduce our friend. His name is Michael Williams. We're going to have a great conversation about genealogy, just continuing the conversation about identity. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth,
reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.